what the future was all about. And what he said was, well, we have a room right next to the Sally Port. That's where you bring in a police car and shut the door behind it and take a suspect out in handcuffs. If that suspect is unruly, and you've got to deal with them in order to fingerprint and so forth, and they're dangerous, they have a room that is floors, wall, and ceiling painted a very, very specific color of pink. And they put that suspect in that room for 17 minutes, not 16, not 18, 17 minutes. And when you pull them out, they're calmed down. You can book them and put them in jail. And that's something that, well, it's interesting from a chief of police that doesn't know anything about human behavior in space. This was as obvious as the sunrise. And it was profound to me to say, there's big companies out here that are every day using how we respond to space profoundly. Now, the studies will also show that they become more unruly about an hour later. So you got to get them behind the bars. But to me, the message is, how can we get our arms around that? And, well, that was many years ago that I had that police station experience, and here we are today at a time when we have that ability. And that's what's really exciting. I think we're at the dawn of really connecting behavior and the environments that we're creating for really exciting outcomes.
All right, I think we were going to go to questions now. So if anybody has any questions?
Yeah, I'm sort of interested if the panelists could comment on the architecture of the big firms are building down the peninsula. You talked about it a little bit. But from an urban design standpoint, and you've talked about them as campuses, but what's happening to the Silicon Valley as an urban form?
I think that, from our point of view, and we're right in downtown Palo Alto, which is becoming increasingly unaffordable for anybody to be there. We've looked at, there's been a whole science parks and all these where you basically contain people and provide services and you try to foster innovation. And consistently they don't work because they don't have the kind of dynamism and sort of the serendipity of interaction with other people and other organizations and completely different people. I mean, in many ways, the reason people really like being in the city is all the stuff that happens outside. It's not just what's happening in the company and in those, I mean, in our case, we see the whole of Palo Alto is basically an extended office space. So people oftentimes go into a coffee shop and they work in a coffee shop and they walk down the street. We have open co-working days where we open up the office and invite anybody who signs up online to basically come and co-work with us. And the kind of serendipity that happens and sort of transfer of ideas is so, so important. And that's the kind of thing that I think people miss when we go into a campus. Now, for a large company, there are a lot of large companies here. It's a whole different environment, but it's maybe you can duplicate some of that internally, but that sort of inflow of ideas from these unsuspected, from a homeless person who is sleeping in your parking lot, or all of these kinds of things, we don't, it has impact.
I think it does. You're describing an urban experience, and I think what's happening in Silicon Valley is it is hemmed in on all sides, and there's no place to grow but by density, and density increasing. Many of the cities across Silicon Valley are changing their zoning codes for density, and the opportunity is a more urban experience. And certainly there's an awful lot of infrastructure that has to go with that, but by not extending horizontally and encouraging more sprawl, I think what we're going to see happening in Silicon Valley is mixed use. So we're bringing live, work, play closer together. And I think the physical circumstances of it are good. It's fortunate that I think it's
We're starting to open up other offices in other cities as well. And the cities that we're choosing are not cities where we think we can recruit, but the cities where our employees have chosen to live naturally, right? So, whereas San Francisco is actually getting smaller for us because it's getting expensive, and so people are, almost nobody lives in Palo Alto or in the peninsula for us because there's no reason to live there unless your work is forcing you to live there. Like it's, I mean, that's not true. If you love it there, it's great. But it's, interestingly, very few of our employees have chosen to live there for the sake of living there. They moved to Portland, they moved to Boulder, they moved to interesting areas where it's cheap and kind of a cool place. And so we're opening offices there. And then we're also seeing that, as we do that, that becomes a little bit more of a draw for other employees to live there. So they'll leave San Francisco and they'll move to Boulder, they'll move to Portland. It doesn't really change the way that they work. And as we're growing, we're starting to, we're opening offices in New Orleans and not New York and Chicago and San Francisco and Palo Alto, but in places that are interesting, places that people have chosen to live because they like living there. And then, so that actually creates some cross sort of culture interactions within those communities, and then also within GitHub, because people will live in San Francisco for a while and then move to Boulder because now there's a thing there, and get to know those people and take their information there. We've also seen some other interesting things where we had this sort of pilot program, not pilot program, but just experiment, I guess, that we call GitHub Destination. So we'll rent an Airbnb in a country, some place that people have always wanted to go. So we did one in Tuscany, we did one in Uruguay, we did one in Hawaii, and then people choose to live there for a month or a couple of weeks or however long they want, and they go and they live there and they have those serendipitous interactions, but it's sort of like this, take their wife and the kids and stuff, and you live there for a month or something because GitHub doesn't care. You get just as much done there as anywhere else, and meet a lot of other people, and so we're seeing interesting sort of artifacts of that. There are interesting side effects to not forcing people to live in a specific place.
Just back to the original question, I think it's interesting. I think a lot of companies are creating these campuses that may only serve to insulate people even more from the world. I know a couple of us talked about influences. I'm from New York City, right? So the whole city thing I think is important. There was an article in the New York Times like 6 months ago about David Byrne and how he rides his bike around New York, and picking up different snippets of conversation and music actually influences his writing process for his music. And I think that's true. I think, unfortunately, the corporate campus approach insulates people who tend to be comfortable being heads down and may not, it's internally maybe innovative, but it's harder to get any outside input. So the whole wisdom of crowd idea is harder when your crowd's all the same, right? And they're all experiencing the same thing. And so I'm not sure it always serves the work that the company's doing. Again, I'm biased for cities, but I feel like I've felt that a little bit, right? That we're in this bubble, we're entitled, that we don't get a lot of input from the outside. It can happen.
You bring to mind Apple's design for the spaceship that they're building, literally a ring. I think, there's basically, I think there's one entrance from, unless you're an employee, you can get in from the parking garage. Very, very close. It's going to be beautiful. They're spending $3 billion or more on it. Anybody want to share an opinion? Has anybody looked at that building? How many people work in there? It's okay. We can only, it used to be that nobody could say anything bad about Apple.
It does kind of go against the whole notion of interacting with the outside world or being open to the outside world. It may be really beautiful, but again, it's a culture thing, right? And it may be that that's a culture you want to foster.
Right. Secrecy is served very well.
Well, I also think one of the interesting things is as we get more and more density with people, at least the campuses appear to be designed for less and less density. Right? So if I look at the VMware campus that's being built when I was leaving, it's gorgeous. It's like a park. They've got a pond, they've got turtles, they've got all kinds of stuff. If you look at Google's campus as well, they have all kinds of grass areas, etc. And so it's less industrial looking. I think somebody said it here tonight, and I've heard this with our architecture firm as well, in terms of looking for ways to bring the outside in, and looking for ways to make it feel more natural. And that's been true to a number of company studies that I've been to. part of that is, so people don't, so people don't feel so closed in, and yet they still are closed in. But I think it's a really interesting trend, right? If you look, again, 10 years ago, at what companies were building, it wasn't this. But it's now become this, is sort of when you talk about campus.
These aren't, go ahead. As I said, these aren't new experiences and lessons learned. I mean, go back to the middle of the last century and some of the great iconic corporate headquarters out in republic settings. And I think, Evan, you're absolutely right, but those are really dangerous in this sort of thinking and introversion. It's not as dynamic as the urban environment. Yet the challenge, particularly in Silicon Valley, is IP protection and real or perceived. It's ways in which we can battle that. It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, just as a sort of implementation standpoint, I think it's also sort of interesting that doing huge corporate campuses like this have a lot of the same problems as like any large monolithic project where it's really, really difficult to execute well, right? Where like whatever you're trying to solve, by the time you actually get it done, it's probably over budget and over, time, and it doesn't really meet your needs the way that you thought because, you have a couple of designers doing it instead of having it be more organic. It's hard to iterate. So, I mean, that's one of, there are obviously advantages and disadvantages of security, sort of whatever your culture is, but if you can do it more piecemeal, if you can have, 1,000, 200 person offices, it's way easier to get them individually right than it is to do, a 200,000 person campus right.
Do you agree with that, Marina? As the futurist on the group, do you agree that, are we going to see fewer sort of huge scale campus kinds of
I wouldn't predict that. we don't predict the future, so, and we don't think that anybody can predict it. It's almost like it's also kind of a status symbol in many ways. I mean, let's be honest about it. It's edifice, and people like to build those. And this is the kind of edifices we build in our modern time. So I don't see that. I do see, what I'm interested in now? I'm watching all these sort of temporary spaces, pop-up spaces that are very creative. Free space in San Francisco, I don't know if you've seen it. These guys got a building for $1 a month, and they opened it up, and it was rented for $24,000. They invited artists, they invited tech shop, I think they invited all kinds of amazing stuff, amazing creativity. They're offering classes, and we're seeing these kind of temporary, very sort of maker kind of creative spaces. I don't know if there's anything like that that's happening internally in companies. Has anybody thought about, like, what if we started something like that internally, or started doing something with those, in those spaces? Because that would be, I'm seeing it in other areas. I don't see kind of in the corporate environment that people sort of adopted that. I don't know, Joe, if you've seen anything like that.
Since you have a question?
Shifting the topic a little bit. So I haven't heard a lot about virtual workspace kind of stuff, like telepresence and, Skype and Google Video Hangouts and things like that. So Tech Shop has 6 physical locations where it doesn't really make a lot of sense to have a virtual presence. The employees have to pretty much be at the location to serve their customers. But our corporate headquarters is completely virtual. We've got people from Marin and Los Angeles and the Bay Area and other parts of the country that are on our corporate team. And we don't even have a headquarters. We have all of our meetings either out in whatever city we happen to be in at the time for an event or an opening, or we use these virtual meetings. Could the panel maybe discuss briefly how that impacts the physical workspace?